The Boeing 707 is a mid-size, long-range, narrow-body four-engine jet airliner built by Boeing Commercial Airplanes from 1958 to 1979. Its name is commonly pronounced as 707. Versions of the aircraft have a capacity from 140 to 189 passengers and a range of 2,500 to 5,750 nautical miles. Developed as Boeing's first jet airliner, the 707 is a swept-wing design with podded engines. Although it was not the first jetliner in service, the 707 was the first to be commercially successful. Dominating passenger air transport in the 1960s and remaining common through the 1970s, the 707 is generally credited with ushering in the jet age. It established Boeing as one of the largest manufacturers of passenger aircraft, and led to the later series of airliners with 7x7 designations. The later 727, 737, and 757 share elements of the 707's fuselage design. The 707 was developed from the Boeing 367-80, a prototype jet first flown in 1954. A larger fuselage cross-section and other modifications resulted in the initial production 707-120, powered by Pratt & Whitney JT3C turbojet engines, which first flew on December 20, 1957. Pan American World Airways began regular 707 service on October 26, 1958. Later derivatives included the shortened long-range 707-138 and the stretched 707-320, both of which entered service in 1959. A smaller short-range variant, the 720, was introduced in 1960. The 707-420, a version of the stretched 707 with Rolls-Royce Conway turbofans, debuted in 1960, while Pratt & Whitney JT3D turbofans debuted on the 707-120B and 707-320B models in 1961 and 1962, respectively. The 707 has been used on domestic, transcontinental and transatlantic flights, and for cargo and military applications. A convertible passenger freighter model, the 707-320C, entered service in 1963, and passenger 707s have been modified to freighter configurations. Military derivatives include the E-3 Sentry airborne reconnaissance aircraft and the C-137 Stratoliner VIP transports. Boeing produced and delivered 1,011 airliners including the smaller 720 series. Over 800 military versions were also produced. There were 10 Boeing 707s in commercial service in July 2013. Development, Model 367-80 origins. During and after World War II, Boeing was known for its military aircraft. The company has produced innovative and important bombers, from the B-17 Flying Fortress and B-29 Superfortress, to the jet-powered B-47 Stratojet and B-52 Stratofortress. The company's civil aviation department lagged far behind Douglas and other competitors, the only noteworthy airliners being the Boeing 314 Clipper and 307 Stratoliner. During 1949–1950 Boeing embarked on studies for a new jet transport, realizing that any design must be aimed at both the military and civil markets. At the time, aerial refueling was becoming a standard technique for military aircraft, with over 800 KC-97 Strato tankers on order. With the advent of the jet age, a new tanker was required to meet the USAF's fleet of jet-powered bombers. This was where Boeing's new design would potentially win military orders. Boeing studied numerous wing and engine layouts for its new transport tanker, some of which were based on the B-47 and C-97, before settling on 367-80. The -80 took less than 2 years from project launch in 1952 to roll out on May 14, 1954, then first flew on July 15, 1954. It was powered by the Pratt & Whitney JT3C turbojet engine, which was the civilian version of the J-57 used on many military aircraft of the day, including the F-100 Super Sabre fighter and the B-52 bomber. The prototype was a proof of concept aircraft for both military and civilian use. The United States Air Force was the first customer, using it as the basis for the KC-135 Stratotanker aerial refueling platform. It was far from certain that the passenger 707 would be profitable. At the time, Boeing was making nearly all of its money from military contracts. Its last passenger transport, the Boeing 377 Stratocruiser, had netted the company a $15 million loss before it was purchased by the Air Force as the KC-97 Stratotanker. In a demonstration flight over Lake Washington outside of Seattle, on August 7, 1955, test pilot Tex Johnston performed a barrel roll in the 367-80 prototype. The 132-inch wide fuselage of the -80 was large enough for 4 abreast seating. Answering customers' demands and under Douglas competition, Boeing soon realized that this would not provide a viable payload, so decided to widen the fuselage to 144 and to allow 5 abreast seating and use of the KC-135's tooling. However, Douglas Aircraft had launched its DC-8 with a fuselage width of 147 in. The airlines liked the extra space and 6 abreast seating, and so Boeing was obliged to increase the 707's width again to compete, this time to 148 in. Production and testing. The first flight of the first production 707-120 took place on December 20, 1957, and FAA certification followed on September 18, 1958. Both test pilots Joseph John Tim Timchison and James A. Gannett were awarded the first Ivan C. Kinshallow Award for the test flights that led to certification. A number of changes were incorporated into the production models from the prototype. A Kruger flap was installed along the leading edge between the inner and outer engines on early 707-120 and A320 models. Further developments. The initial standard model was the 707-120 with JT3C turbojet engines. Qantas ordered a shorter body version called the 707-138, which was AA120 that had 6 fuselage frames removed, 3 in front of the wings, and 3 aft. The frames in the 707 were each 20 inches apart, so this resulted in a net shortening of 10 ft to 134 ft 6 in. Because the maximum takeoff weight remained the same 247,000 lb as that of the A120, the 138 was able to fly the longer routes that Qantas needed. Brunei International Airways ordered the higher thrust version with Pratt & Whitney JT4A engines, the 707-220. The final major derivative was the 707-320, which featured an extended span wing and JT4A engines, while the 707-420 was the same as the A320 but with Conway turbofan engines. British certification requirements relating to engine out-go-arounds also forced Boeing to increase the height of the tail fin on all 707 variants, as well as add a ventral fin, which was retrofitted on earlier A120 and A220 aircraft. These modifications also aided in the mitigation of Dutch roll by providing more stability in yaw. Though initially fitted with turbojet engines, the dominant engine for the Boeing 707 family was the Pratt & Whitney JT3D, a turbofan variant of the JT3C with lower fuel consumption and higher thrust. JT3D engines 707s and 720s were denoted with a B suffix. While many 707-120BS and 720BS were conversions of existing JT3C-powered machines, 707-320BS were available only as newly built aircraft, as they had a stronger structure to support a maximum takeoff weight increased by 19,000 lb, along with modifications to the wing. The 707-320B series enabled non-stop westbound flights from Europe to the U.S. West Coast and from the U.S. to Japan. The final 707 variant was the 707-320C, which had a large fuselage door for cargo. It had a revised wing with 3-section leading-edge flaps, improving takeoff and landing performance and allowed the ventral fin to be removed. 707-320BS built after 1963 used the same wing as the A320C and were known as 707-320B advanced aircraft. Production of the passenger 707 ended in 1978. In total, 1,010 707s were built for civil use, though many of these found their way to military service. The 707 production line remained open for purpose-built military variants until 1991, with the last new-build 707 airframes built as E-3 and E-6 aircraft. Traces of the 707 are still found in the 737, which uses a modified version of the 707's fuselage, as well as the same external nose and cockpit configuration as those of 707. These were also used on the previous 727, while the 757 also used the 707 fuselage cross-section. The Chinese government sponsored development of the Shanghai Y-10 during the 1970s, which was a near-carbon copy of the 707. However, this did not enter production and only 3 prototypes were built. Design: wings. The 707 wings are swept back at 35 degrees and, like all swept-wing aircraft, displayed an undesirable Dutch roll flying characteristic that manifested itself as an alternating yawing and rolling motion. Boeing already had considerable experience with this on the B-47 and B-52, and had developed the yaw damper system on the B-47 that would be applied to later swept-wing configurations like the 707. However, many new 707 pilots had no experience with this phenomenon, as they were transitioning from straight-wing propeller-driven aircraft such as the Douglas DC-7 and Lockheed Constellation. On one customer acceptance flight, where the yaw damper was turned off to familiarize the new pilots with flying techniques, a trainee pilot's actions violently exacerbated the Dutch roll motion and caused 3 of the 4 engines to be torn from the wings. The plane, a brand new 707-227, N7071, destined for Brunei, crash-landed on a riverbed north of Seattle at Arlington, Washington, killing 4 of the 8 occupants. In his autobiography, test pilot Tex Johnston described a Dutch roll incident he experienced as a passenger on an early commercial 707 flight. As the aircraft's movements did not cease and most of the passengers became ill, he suspected a misrigging of the directional autopilot. He went to the cockpit and found the crew unable to understand and resolve the situation. He introduced himself and relieved the ashen-faced captain who immediately left the cockpit feeling ill. Johnston disconnected the faulty autopilot and manually stabilized the plane with 2 slide control movements. Engines. The 707s used engine-driven turbo compressors to supply high-pressure bleed air for pressurization. On many commercial 707s, the outer port engine mount is distinctly different from the other 3, as this is the only engine not fitted with a turbo compressor. The turbo compressors fitted on engines 2 through 4 provide the required triple redundancy for the aircraft's cabin pressurization and air conditioning system. The P&W JT3D3B engines are readily identifiable by the large gray secondary air inlet doors in the nose cowl. These doors are fully open during takeoff to provide additional air. When the engines are throttled back to cruise, the doors are shut. The 707 was the first commercial jet aircraft to be fitted with clamshell-type thrust reversers on each of the 4 engines. Upgraded engines. Pratt & Whitney, in a joint venture with 7Q7 and Omega Air, has selected the JT8D219 as a re-engine power plant for Boeing 707-based aircraft, calling their modified configuration a 707RE. Northrop Grumman has selected the A219 to re-engine the United States Air Force's fleet of 19 E-8 Joint Stars aircraft, which will allow the J-Stars more time on station due to the engine's greater fuel efficiency. NATO also plans to re-engine their fleet of E-3 Sentry AWACS aircraft. The A219 is publicized as being half the cost of the competing 707 re-engine power plant, the CFM International CFM56, and is 40 decibels quieter than JT3D engines that are being replaced. Operational history. The first commercial orders for the 707 came on October 13, 1955, when Pan Am committed to 20 707s and 25 Douglas DC-8s, a dramatic increase in passenger capacity over its existing fleet of propeller aircraft. The competition between the 707 and Douglas DC-8 was fierce. Several major airlines committed only to the DC-8, as Douglas Aircraft was a more established maker of passenger aircraft at the time. To stay competitive, Boeing made a late and costly decision to redesign and enlarge the 707's wing to help increase range and payload. The new version was numbered 707-320. Pan Am was the first airline to operate the 707. The carrier inaugurated 707 service with a christening at National Airport on October 17, 1958, attended by President Eisenhower, followed by a transatlantic flight for VIPs from Baltimore's Friendship International Airport to Paris. The aircraft's first commercial flight was from New York to Paris on October 26, 1958 with a fuel stop in Gander, Newfoundland. In December, National Airlines operated the first U.S. domestic jet airline flights between New York Idlewild and Miami, using 707s leased from Pan Am. American Airlines was the first domestic airline to fly its own jets, on January 25, 1959. TWA started domestic 707-131 flights in March and Continental Airlines started 707-124 flights in June. Airlines that had ordered only the DC-8, such as United, Delta, and Eastern, were left without jets until September and lost market share on transcontinental flights. Qantas was the first non-U.S. airline to use the 707s, starting in 1959. The 707 quickly became the most popular jetliner of its time. Its popularity led to rapid developments in airport terminals, runways, airline catering, baggage handling, reservation systems, and other air transport infrastructure. The advent of the 707 also led to the upgrading of air traffic control systems to prevent interference with military jet operations. As the 1960s drew to a close, the exponential growth in air travel led to the 707's being a victim of its own success. The 707 was now too small to handle the increased passenger densities on the routes for which it was designed. Stretching the fuselage was not a viable option because the installation of larger, more powerful engines would in turn need a larger undercarriage, which was not feasible given the design's limited ground clearance. Boeing's answer to the problem was the first twin-aisle airliner, the Boeing 747. The 707's first-generation engine technology was also rapidly becoming obsolete in the areas of noise and fuel economy, especially after the 1973 oil crisis. In 1982, during the Falklands War, the Argentine Air Force extensively used 707s for long-range maritime patrol, with some of them being intercepted and shepherded away by Royal Navy Sea Harriers. It also led to the conversion of British Nimrods to carry Sidewinder air-to-air missiles after a casual encounter. Trans World Airlines flew the last scheduled 707 flight for passengers by a U.S. carrier on October 30, 1983, although 707s remained in scheduled service by airlines from other nations for much longer. Middle East Airlines of Lebanon flew 707s and 720s in frontline passenger service until the end of the 1990s. Since Lade of Argentina took its 707-320B from regular service in 2007, Saha Airlines of Iran was the last airline to keep 707s in scheduled passenger service until April 2013. Operations of the 707 were threatened by the enactment of international noise regulations in 1985. Shannon Engineering of Seattle, Washington developed a hush kit with funding from Tracor, Incorporated, of Austin, Texas. By the late 1980s, 172 Boeing 707s had been equipped with the Quiet 707 package. Boeing acknowledged that more 707s were in service then than before the hush kit was available. Most remaining 707s are in freighter form, or as business jets. Variants, although certificated as Series 100s, 200s, 300s, etc., the different 707 variants are more commonly known as Series 120s, 220s, 320s, and so on, where the 20 part of the designation is Boeing's customer number for its development aircraft. 707-020 The 707-020 was the original designation for what ultimately became the Boeing 720. Launch customer United Airlines was a Douglas DC-8 customer and preferred not to be seen as buying the competing 707, hence the 720 designation. American Airlines always referred to its 720s as 707s. 707-120. The 707-120 was the first production 707 variant, with a longer, wider fuselage, and greater wingspan than the -80. The cabin had a full set of rectangular windows and could seat up to 179 passengers. It was designed for transcontinental routes and often required a refueling stop when flying across the North Atlantic. It had 4 Pratt & Whitney JT3C6 turbojets, civil versions of the military J57, initially producing 13,000 lb with water injection. Maximum takeoff weight was 247,000 lb and first flight was on December 20, 1957. Major orders were the launch order for 2707-121 aircraft by Pan American and an American Airlines order for 3707-123 aircraft. The first revenue flight was on October 26, 1958. 56 were built, plus 7 short-body A138s. The last A120 was delivered to Westin in May 1960. The 707-138 was AA120 with a fuselage 10 feet shorter than the others, with 5 feet removed ahead and behind the wing, giving increased range. Maximum takeoff weight was the same 247,000 lb as the standard version. It was a variant for Qantas, thus had its customer number 38. The 701-38s were delivered to Qantas September 1959 and first carried passengers that July. The 707-120B had Pratt & Whitney JT3D1 turbofan engines, which were quieter, more powerful, and more fuel-efficient, producing 17,000 pound-force each, with the later JT3D3 version giving 18,000 pound-force. The A120B had the wing modifications introduced on the 720 and a longer tailplane. A total of 72 were built, 31 for American and 41 for TWA, plus 6 short-body A138BS for Qantas. American had its 23 surviving A123s converted to 123BS but TWA did not convert its 15-131s. The only other conversions were Pan American's 5 surviving A121s and 1 surviving A139, the 3 aircraft delivered to the USAF as A153s and the 7 short-body Qantas A138s. The first flight of the A120B was on June 22, 1960 and American carried the first passengers in March 1961. The last delivery was to American in April 1969. Maximum weight was 258,000 lb for both the long and short body versions. 707-220, the 707-220 was designed for hot and high operations with more powerful 15,800 lb Pratt & Whitney JT4A3 turbojets. 5 of these were produced, but only 4 were ultimately delivered with 1 being lost during a test flight. All were for Brunei International Airways and carried the model number 707-227. The first entered service in December 1959. This version was made obsolete by the arrival of the turbofan-powered 707-120B, 707-320. The 707-320 Intercontinental is a stretched version of the turbojet-powered 707-120, initially powered by JT4A3 or JT4A5 turbojets producing 15,800 lb each JT4A11s. The interior allowed up to 189 passengers due to an 80-inch fuselage stretch ahead of the wing to 145 ft6 in, with extensions to the fin and horizontal stabilizer extending the aircraft's length further. The longer wing carried more fuel, increasing range by 1,600 miles and allowing the aircraft to operate as true transoceanic aircraft. The wing modifications included outboard and inboard inserts, as well as a kink in the trailing edge to add area inboard. Takeoff weight was increased to 302,000 lb initially and to 312,000 lb with the higher-rated JT4s and center section tanks. First flight was on January 11, 1958. 69 turbojet 707-320s were delivered through January 1963, the first passengers being carried in August 1959. No A320 intercontinental models were re-engined with fan engines in civil use, but around year 2000 the Israeli Air Force re-engined 2X Sabino A320-based military tankers. 707-420. The 707-420 was identical to the A320 but fitted with Rolls-Royce Conway 508 turbofans of 18,000 lb thrust each. First announced customer was Lufthansa. BOAC's controversial order was announced 6 months later, but the British carrier got the first service-ready aircraft off the production line. The British Air Registration Board refused to give the aircraft a certificate of airworthiness, citing insufficient lateral control, excessive rudder forces and the ability to over-rotate on takeoff, stalling the wing on the ground. Boeing responded by adding 40 inches to the vertical tail, applying full instead of partial rudder boost and fitting an underfin to prevent over-rotation. These modifications became standard on all 707 variants and were retrofitted to all earlier 707s. The 37-420s were delivered to BOAC, Lufthansa, Air India, El Al and Varig through November 1963. Lufthansa was the first to carry passengers, in March 1960. 707-320B. The 707-320B saw the application of the JT3D turbofan to the Intercontinental but with aerodynamic refinements. The wing was modified from the A320 by adding a second inboard kink, a dog-toothed leading edge, and curved low-drag wingtips instead of the earlier blunt ones. These wingtips increased overall wingspan by 3 feet. Takeoff gross weight was increased to 328,000 lb. The 175 707-320B aircraft were all new build. No original A320 models were converted to fan engines in civilian use. First service was June 1962, with Pan Am. The 707-320B Advanced is an improved version of the A320B, adding the 3-section leading-edge flaps already seen on the A320C. These reduced takeoff and landing speeds and altered the lift distribution of the wing, allowing the ventral fin found on earlier 707s to be deleted. From 1965-320BS had the uprated A320C undercarriage allowing the same 335,000 lb MTOW. These were often identified as 707-320BAH, 707-320C. The 707-320C has a convertible passenger Eurofreight configuration, which became the most widely produced variant of the 707. The 707-320C added a strengthened floor and a new cargo door to the A320B model. The wing was fitted with 3-section leading-edge flaps which allowed the deletion of the underfin. 335 of these variants were built, including a small number with JT3D7 engines and a takeoff gross weight of 335,000 lb. Ironically, most A320CS were delivered as passenger aircraft, airlines hoping that the cargo door would increase second-hand values. The addition of 2 additional emergency exits, one on either side aft of the wing, raised the maximum passenger capacity to a theoretical 219. Only a few aircraft were delivered as pure freighters. One of the final orders was by the Iranian government for 14 707-3J9C aircraft capable of VIP transportation, communication, and in-flight refueling tasks. Other variants, the 707-620 was a proposed domestic range-stretched variant of the 707-320B. The 707-620 was to carry around 200 passengers while retaining several aspects of the 707-320B. It would have been delivered around 1968 and would have also been Boeing's answer to the stretch Douglas DC-8 Series 60. Had the 707-620 been built, it would have cost around $8 million in U.S. currency. However, engineers discovered that a longer fuselage and wing meant a painstaking redesign of the wing and landing gear structures. Rather than spend money on upgrading the 707, engineer Joe Sucker stated the company decided spending money on the 707 wasn't worth it. The project was cancelled in 1966 in favor of the newer Boeing 747. The 707-700 was a test aircraft used to study the feasibility of using CFM International's CFM56 powerplants on a 707 airframe and possibly retrofitting them to existing aircraft. After a testing in 1979, N707QT, the last commercial 707 airframe, was refitted to 707-320C configuration and delivered to the Moroccan Air Force as a tanker aircraft. Boeing abandoned the program, since it felt it would be a threat to the Boeing 757 program. The information gathered in the test led to the eventual retrofitting program of CFM56 engines to the USAF C-135/KC-135R models, and some military versions of the 707 also used the CFM56. The Douglas DC-8 Super 70 series by Cammacorp did develop commercially, extending the life of DC-8 airframes in a stricter noise regulatory environment, so there are today more DC-8s in commercial service than there are 707s. The 707-820 was a proposed intercontinental stretched variant of the 707-320B. It was to be powered by 4 Pratt & Whitney JT3D15 turbofan engines and would have had a 10-foot extension in wingspan. 2 variations were proposed, the 707-820, 505, model and the 707-820, 506, model. The 505 model would have had a fuselage 45 feet longer than the 707-320B and would have carried 209 passengers in mixed-class configuration and 260 passengers in all-economy configuration. The 506 model would have had a fuselage 55 feet longer than the 707-320B and would have carried 225 passengers in mixed-class configuration and 279 passengers in all-economy configuration. Like the 707-620, the 707-820 was also set to compete with the stretch DC-8s. The design was being pitched to American, TWA, BOAC and Pan Am at the time of its proposal in early 1965. The 707-820 would have cost $10 million in U.S. currency. Just like the 707-620, the 707-820 would have required a massive structural redesign to the wing and gear structures. The 707-820 was also cancelled in 1966 in favor of the 747. Military. The militaries of the United States and other countries have used the civilian 707 aircraft in a variety of roles, and under different designations. The Boeing E-3 Sentry is a U.S. military airborne warning and control system aircraft based on the Boeing 707 that provides all-weather surveillance, command, control and communications. The VC-137C variant of the Stratoliner was a special-purpose design meant to serve as Air Force One, the secure transport for the President of the United States of America. These models were in operational use from 1962 to 1990. The 2 aircraft remain on display. SAM 26000 is at the National Museum of the United States Air Force near Dayton, Ohio, and SAM 27000 is at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library in Simi Valley, California. The Canadian Forces also operated Boeing 707 with designation CC-137 Husky from 1971 to 1997. 717, Boeing 717 was the company designation for C-135 Stratolifter and KC-135 Stratotanker derivatives of the 367-80. The designation was later reused in renaming the McDonnell Douglas MD-95 to Boeing 717 after the company was merged with Boeing. Operators. Boeing's customer codes used to identify specific options and liveries specified by customers was started with the 707, and has been maintained through all Boeing's models. In essence the same system as used on the earlier Boeing 377, the code consisted of 2 digits affixed to the model number to identify the specific aircraft version. For example, Pan American Airlines was assigned code 21. Thus, a 707-320B sold to Pan Am had the model number 707-321B. The number remained constant as further aircraft were purchased. Thus, when Pan American purchased the 747-100 it had the model number 747-121. In the 1980s, the USAF acquired around 250 used 707s to provide parts for the KC-135E Stratotanker program. The 707 is no longer operated by major airlines. A total of 10 aircraft were in commercial service with Saha Airlines, Hua Bora Airways, and operators with 1 aircraft as of July 2013. American actor John Travolta owns an ex-Qantas 707-138B, registration N707JT. He is also qualified to fly it as second-in-command. Mirage Airlines has 2 Boeing 707s in their fleet as a VIP aircraft. Orders and deliveries, 707 model summary, Boeing, accidents and incidents. As of May 2011, the 707 has been in a total of 170 hull loss occurrences with 2,739 fatalities. Aircraft on display. VHXBA Model 707-138B, one of the first 707s exported, and the first civilian jet registered in Australia, is on display at the Qantas Founders Outback Museum in Longreach, Queensland, Australia. 4XBYD Model 707-131, F, ex-Israeli Air Force and TWA aircraft is on display at the Israeli Air Force Museum near Hatzerim, Israel. 4XJYW Model 707-328, former Air France aircraft sold to the Israeli Air Force, aircraft on display at the Israeli Air Force Museum, Beersheba Euro Hatzerim, GAPFJ Model 707-436. Ford fuselage on display at National Museum of Flight, East Fortune in BOAC livery. DAFHG Model 707-430 former Lufthansa airliner on display at Hamburg Airport, N130KR Model 707-458 former El Al aircraft restored in 1960s Lufthansa markings with fictitious registration DABOC previously displayed at Berliner Eurotagel. Now parked at the edge of the airfield. CCCCG Model 707-330B. This ex-Lufthansa and LAN Chile is undergoing restoration at Santiago a Euro Los Cerrillos, Chile, and will be repainted in the Chilean Airlines 1960s scheme. FBLCD Model 707-328B is on display at the Musée Copyright de l'Oreille de l'Espace, Paris, France. EPIRJ Model 707-321B former Iran Air aircraft originally delivered to Pan American as N416PA is currently the air restaurant at Murabad Airport, Tehran. A20-627 Model 707-338C flew with the RAAF. Originally delivered to Qantas as VHEAG. Ford fuselage preserved at the RAAF Museum, Point Cook, Vic, Australia. 1419 Model 707-328C XSAAF aircraft is on display at the South African Air Force Museum a Euro Swartkop Air Force Base, Pretoria. 1419 a Euro 83-8033 Model 707-328C of the South African Air Force. Originally delivered to Air France as FBLCL. Complete airframe preserved at the SAAF Museum, Swartkop, South Africa, N893PA Model 707-321B former CAAC aircraft originally delivered to Pan American is preserved at Tianjin, China. HZHM2 Model 707-386C Saudi Air Force VIP aircraft painted in the current Saudi color scheme. Delaware, 1975, Reg. HZHM1. Preserved at Saudi Air Force Museum, Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. Specifications, sources, notable appearances in media. The 707 is mentioned in the songs Boeing 707, written and performed by Roger Miller. Jet Airliner, written by Paul Penner and performed by the Steve Miller Band. And Early Morning Rain, written by Gordon Lightfoot and popularized by artists such as Elvis Presley, Bob Dylan, and Peter, Paul and Mary. The aircraft has had major roles in the airport and airplane films, and has been alluded to in both television and theatrical movies. In 2011, the American television series Pan Am takes place in the early and mid-1960s and features interior sets and exterior CGI representations of the 707 on the ground and in flight. It was Pan Am's frontline airliner during that time. Additional footage of John Travolta's Boeing 707 in Pan Am livery has also been used in the TV series. See also. Related development, Boeing 367-80, KC-135 Stratotanker, Boeing 720, Boeing 727, Boeing 737, aircraft of comparable role, configuration and era, de Havilland Comet, Convair 880, Douglas DC-8, Ilyushin Il-62, Shanghai Y-10, Tupolev Tu-114, Vickers VC-10, related lists, list of airliners, list of Boeing customers, references, notes. Bibliography. External links, Boeing 707 family on Boeing.com, detailed guide to all variants of the 707/720 on airlinercafe.com, Boeing 707 page on airliners.net, a proposed double-decker design for the 707, video DVD on an air refueling mission brought to the B707TT tanker of Italian Air Force, Boeing 707 Revelations, a 1956 flight article on the forthcoming 707.